I think I'll move up here just so I'll be a little bit closer to the action here. And what did I do with the, oh, here's the clicker, yes, okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank Natalia and everyone at AIER for inviting me up today. I've known about the Institute for a long, long time, but I've never been up here, so this is a nice experience for me. I just feel a little sorry for you folks, though, that you have to work in such an unattractive place. I mean, this is has to be one of the prettiest spots in New England. I've been up to this area once or twice before, but not down these roads, and it really is quite a spectacular place. But anyway, I know that can be a distraction sometimes, but it also can be a good work environment. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today. Natalia mentioned that I do sort of urban and regional economics and health economics, and there's a little bit of both in this presentation. In the empirical analysis, there are some variables we include that have to do with sort of healthcare resources and the like. And so I guess that's where my two interests sort of merge in this particular topic. This is not really finished research, but I think it's far enough along that I can show it to you and get some feedback from you, which will be very helpful. And I hope maybe we can take some time at the end to do that. And also, I think it's always interesting to think a little bit about where you go next with a project, and sometimes you generate some interesting ideas in doing that. So hopefully we'll have enough time at the end to do that. What is our timeline here? I don't want to.
Well, I thought it was like an hour and then questions.
About an hour with, okay, all right. So the title here, obviously to do with interstate migration and some of the different factors that influence interstate migration. And I'll just have to get used to this clicker here. Here we go. So the question, first of all, I guess, is why focus on migration? Why is it an important topic? It's interesting because there was a lot of work done on migration back in the 60s and 70s, early 80s, and there still is work being done, and it's not purely by economists. Some of it's by sociologists, geographers. There's a lot of different people that have published interesting work on migration. Obviously, from an economist point of view, one of the reasons why migration is a potentially important issue is we tend to think that resources are used more efficiently when they're mobile. That sort of allows people to exploit opportunities to improve outcomes. So in that sense, having a fairly mobile economy is something that I think is of value. There are, of course, a lot of immobile resources, but the one that at least in this economy is relatively mobile is labor. By the way, if you think that's universally true, it's not. My wife is from South Wales in the UK, and I think it's a little different today, but when I first met her, it was very, very unusual for people to move out of their local area. And one reflection of that was dialects became so localized that there were places near where my wife's family lived where even I, who didn't have a particularly well-trained ear for dialects at that point, could tell somebody from that little village because they spoke in a different way. So some of these things are tied up with customs and the way we speak and everything else. But from an economic point of view, obviously, we're kind of interested in migration as a mechanism for improving resource allocation. One point I just want to make here is obviously migration can kind of be a cause or a consequence of economic conditions. If you look at the migration to California during the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s, in the Midwest, they went through these terrible dust storms that just devastated the crops and so forth. And so there was a tremendous amount of movement to the West, particularly California. So that was sort of a consequence of some bad economic conditions. But then you also find situations where there's kind of an effect of the migration, and I guess a contrasting situation would be the movement of high-skilled labor to the West Coast. Obviously, that had beneficial effects on those economies in the Western states. So migration is something that's pretty complex. There are a lot of different factors that we know have some impact. There's been enough study of migration that if you go through a lot of these articles and start compiling, you know, what have we learned from all of this, you find out that there are just a whole lot of factors that seem to affect those decisions. And obviously, some of the obvious ones are age, gender, educational attainment, these sorts of things. Obviously, those characteristics can vary not only geographically across different jurisdictions, but they can change over time. One source of information, one of the things that migration provides us is a lot of information about who we are and where we want to be at various points in time. And it's sort of a revealed preference thing. You know, people are actually getting up and moving, and we'll talk in a minute about the various reasons for that, but it is a way in which people kind of reveal their preferences, probably not just for a location, but for other kinds of things as well, jobs and living conditions and whatnot.
Question?
Yes.
Concerning the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Wasn't it the weather? It was drought?
Right, but the weather created, right. It was basically a meteorological condition, but it so damaged the Midwest economy that people had no choice but to move. So it was, in that sense, it was, you know.
You didn't say that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. No, but that's a good point. So one point I just wanted to make here is that not all migration is rational. Economists like to think in terms of rational behavior, although that's changed a lot too. There's a lot of interesting work being done looking at less than rational forms of behavior. But not all of these moves that we see are resulting from economically rational considerations. Some migration is what we might call idiosyncratic, and it was sort of spur of the moment move. Somebody wakes up and they decide they want to move to Texas. Well, it's not clear that we're going to understand that in any sort of systematic way. Those sorts of things obviously occur. But there are other things, of course, that are kind of sporadic firings, family crises, people getting accepted at a college, maybe where they didn't expect to get accepted, and all of a sudden now they're changing location. So there are lots of, as I say, idiosyncratic reasons to move. But there's also, I think, more deliberative kinds of migration. And some of the ones that sort of fall into that category would be things like job search, opportunities for promotion, people seeking out better weather conditions or environmental conditions, access to health care. The reason I've thrown that in, by the way, is one of the things that we'll look at in some of the econometric work is looking at the influence of access to certain kinds of healthcare resources and see whether or not that has any impact, especially after you control for some of these other factors. It's likely, I think, that recessions are going to influence this mix, and in particular, I guess my reasoning would be that the economic reasons may sort of dominate people's decisions about migration when the times are hard, when things are not going well. Those economic factors may play an important role. And I guess the rationale or the explanation of that is that there's kind of more at stake. You know, if you're in a period of high unemployment and your job is at greater risk, you may be a lot less likely to be suddenly moving unless you have secured another job first. So the conditions of the economy obviously play a role in these kinds of decisions as well. So the point here is that recessions are likely to shape migration. Expansions are likely to shape migration as well. It so happens the period that we're going to look at in this study, which is some data from the American Community Survey, the 2005 to 2009 data, is sort of straddles the latest or the last major recession that we had. So I kind of expected in selecting that particular time frame that we might see fairly strong economic influences, and we'll see later on how that pans out. One of the things that, whoops, sorry, I guess I didn't have that highlighted, but I was just making the point here that the effects of recession on migration are not always entirely clear-cut. You know, you have these sort of local downturns which may prompt people to get up and seek another location, another job. But the other thing that happens, of course, during economic downturns is people who manage to keep their jobs probably become increasingly cautious. They may be less likely to get up and move just on the off chance that they might secure a better position. Now, if they're offered one with surety, then of course that they might move. But the point is there are kind of effects that run both ways, I think, during these recessions. So there is kind of an open question. I guess I would start out by assuming almost that recessions have some impact on migration, but it's not, you know, theoretically, it's not entirely clear-cut which direction that goes in terms of the volume of migration. One of the things in this next slide I'll show you, there does seem to be some evidence of the negative effect of recessions on, at least on foreign-born population in the U.S., which is obviously reflecting migration to some extent. And we'll see that it's not a nice, steady pattern, that it seems to be tied in a little bit with recessions. But at the same time, this exact same slide kind of shows that you have ups and downs in this proportion of foreign-born population, even between recessions. So there obviously are other things besides recessions that are driving these migration decisions. And the final point here that what this all kind of points to is just, I think, a more complex model of migration that takes into account a lot of different factors. So this is the slide I was referring to. This is from a place called the Migration Policy Institute of the Census Bureau. And you can see the two dark shaded vertical bars. Those are recessions in the early part of the decade, and then the sort of 07, 08 recession. And you can see there are some kind of distinct downturns, particularly in the first one. The second one, interestingly enough, which was a more severe recession, there's a downturn, but it's not dramatic. And of course, the other thing is that you've got all these ups and downs in between. So should we really make a lot of the fact that we had these downturns during the recession? Because we can find lots of other downturns during periods that were not so characterized by recession. Yes?
So why are you looking on foreign population?
Oh, it's not germane to what I'm going to be doing because I'm going to be looking at interstate migration, but this was, I thought, kind of a nice illustration of the fact that migration does seem to be sensitive to economic conditions, but it's not always quite so clear-cut, you know, what's going on. But clearly there is some responsiveness even at the national level.
Because you see, like, also,
Yeah.
Because I think also the native-born population maybe will be more susceptible to those factors.
Possibly, yes. Yeah.
Family or whatever. Because if I move here, kind of
Right.
like the family factors and whatever other factors you're talking about
Yeah.
before, I think they're more profound for
Right.
the US-born
Right.
rather than foreign-born.
That's right. That's right.
So that's
Yeah.
why
Yeah, and I think you know, realistically, if as I say, the model I'm going to show you was really intended to describe interstate migration, and it seems to me if you want to develop a model of international migration, it might be a very different model.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it might have a number of the same things, but there's probably going to be some other factors that are critical. Not the least of which is immigration policy, right? Which we don't, you know, doesn't play a role so much in interstate
Right, that's
migration.
why, like, I think maybe domestic bond is
Yeah.
will be more of a showcase.
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah, right. And by the way, the other thing, this obviously is reflecting kind of a time series. The data and the results that I'm going to show you are based on some cross-sectional analysis that we did, looking at, you know, trying to explain interstate migration within a specific period.
Is it, Ken, did you want to-
I'm sorry, yes.
Okay.
Okay. So this internal migration that we're going to focus on can also be cyclical, but the migration flows that we're going to, as I say, going to be looking at are really, this is really cross-sectional data essentially. But I guess I would argue that these interstate movements are still going to be subject to a number of the same kinds of forces, to economic conditions, access to various kinds of resources. Those are all things that kind of enter into people's mind when they make decisions about movement. And so I don't think it's totally divorced from the international migration literature, but clearly you're probably going to have a somewhat different model. So this is essentially cross-sectional data. It is from this American Community Survey 5-year report for 2005-2009. And I think many of you are probably familiar with the ACS and how this data is collected sort of annually, but it's sort of a sampling, a rolling sample that goes forth. And so they publish these 3-year estimates, 5-year estimates, so forth, but they are annualized figures. So I guess the way I would interpret these as they're gathered for the various states over this 5-year period, and the resulting figures that you get are kind of annualized rates of interstate migration that in some sense reflect the average behavior over that time frame. It is a little difficult interpreting the ACS because of this kind of sampling procedure that they use, but the advantage of that, of course, is the precision probably improves a little bit over those multiple periods. So the primary question here is, did economic factors dominate sort of non-economic factors? And some of the non-economic factors I'm going to include are some health-related indicators. The objects here that we're looking at are the sort of 52 jurisdictions. We have the 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. So you have a total of 2,652 observations or migration flows between these different pairs of quote states, right? This way, when I first gave this talk, I was giving it to a Greek audience, and I wasn't sure they all entirely understood the nature of our state system. So I was just showing them or giving them an idea of the 52 states here. So, sorry, yes?
So what you're getting from the Census Bureau
Yeah.
is maps, distributions, population density maps, right?
No. Actual numbers. Actual numbers, but it's the ACS. You could use them to generate maps. But this,
But then you also get flow between the,
Right.
As on the basis of the distributions, right?
Right.
So
that's right. Any pair of states.
it's changing.
Yeah, and they publish both in migration and out migration, and so you'll see how we sort of handle that. So one of the things that we're doing here is we're excluding intra-state migration, that is migration that occurs within each state. The vast majority of moves are exactly that. You know, people changing neighborhoods, buying a new house, or getting reassigned to another office or something that doesn't require them moving out of state. So a large portion of the moves that you can pick up in the data are of that nature. But I'm particularly interested in this study on these decisions about people getting up and moving to a different state. One reason for that is with these in-state moves, we actually, in some ways, have less information. You know, if I could track everybody between communities, then obviously you could use that level of information. But here we are using these interstate moves, and so we are focusing only between state moves. So for these moves, obviously one of the kind of critical variables is distance, and particularly in the kind of model we're going to use here, which is essentially a gravity type model, where the movement is sort of thought to be proportional to or positively related to the population masses at both the origin and the destination, but kind of inversely related to the distance between them. So it's much like the notion of gravity, okay? Hence the name gravity model. And this, when you start looking at this data, you'll see that there actually is kind of a secular decline in these cross-state moves. And you can see those, all moves, by the way, is the light blue line at the top. So first of all, one of the things you can see here is that, let me see if I got the pointer here. Yeah. You can see that these cross-state or interstate moves are really a kind of a small fraction of the total moves that go on. You know, the bulk of moves that people make are within state. So we're only focusing on this smaller category. But you can also see in both of these, there's been kind of a secular decline. It's not it's not dramatic, although this one up here, there's a fairly substantial decline in these total of all moves. And this was over a fairly long period. Notice that this goes from 47 up to 2010. So this is not something new. I mean, this has kind of been happening. And it's a little bit counter, I think, sometimes to people's notion that somehow we've just become a much more mobile society. You know, this sort of belies that a little bit, that at least if you look at in percentage terms, obviously numbers of people, that's been going up, but in percentage terms, it's not clear that we're quite as mobile as we think we are.
There is also this spike for the 84, isn't it?
Yeah.
Recession is a great illustration of this 81, 82 recession.
Yeah, yeah.
Big spike on that.
Yeah, it may well be, you know, people seeking better economic environments, right? And again, you can kind of see this is not a steady pattern. It's, you know, a fair amount of variability going on. Yes?
Do you know what would happen if you excluded households with elderly heads of household or retirees?
I don't. And I will show you a slide in a minute that shows kind of the life cycle of migration. That's kind of interesting because you can see people are much more prone to migrate at certain points in their life. And so obviously, and in fact it's interesting, in the migration literature there are some studies where they've kind of focused on specific age groups. And oftentimes their behavior is somewhat different than, you know, other age groups. So we're kind of lumping everybody together here, you know, and in some ways we're losing information by doing that. But I suppose it also, you know, we're kind of focused more on the total effect of these moves as opposed to some specific group. One of the things that's interesting about the migration literature is it's really varied. I mean, as I mentioned before, there are people from all different disciplines that have kind of worked in this area, and they all have slightly different things that they're trying to tweak out of the data. But it's a rich source of information, and I think it's also a rich source of research topics because there are just a lot of different issues that crop up around migration. Yes?
So just to clarify, okay, so you're looking at, I just missed kind of the beginning
Yeah.
research question, was like, did economic forces dominate over none in the number or change of migration or the decision?
The number
to migrate?
the number
So
of
just
migrants.
the number.
Yeah.
And then did that include only households as defined by ACS or just any individuals, whether or not they're heads of households?
I think these were, I think these were individuals.
All individuals.
I think this was all individuals. I need to go back and really look, but I'm pretty sure it was. I think there may be a slide in a minute that will resolve
Then I
that.
have another
Yes,
question.
okay.
Okay, so I have observation also that was pointed out. So also look at that, 2001 recession and 2007.
Yeah.
In fact, you see that they're going down.
Yeah.
The decline. So
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by the change.
But the difference, yeah.
81,
Yeah.
everyone was actually moving,
Yeah.
and 2001,
Yeah.
people were actually staying.
Yeah.
So
Well, the other thing you need to think about too, migration is very age sensitive. So if you overlay, for example, changes in the population age structure,
He's also Rustin's comment, right? It's
Yeah.
also this age, maybe people were moving towards their
Yeah.
elders, or now they're not.
Yeah,
They're
right,
taking care
right.
of them.
exactly. Or if you have a big bulge of elderly hitting, you know, at a particular point in time, you know, that may influence the overall pattern. It's a very complex pattern that you see out there.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Question. Okay, like if you have a second note that there is no data, so how will you deal with that? How will you deal with that no data?
Not present in CPS data.
So, like,
Between, oh, in the CPS data,
right.
the current population survey data between 71 and 74 and between 76 and 79. So I don't know whether they have just interpolated between those years here or,
Or you mean the census people? Or it's
well, yeah, because this was a graph from the U.S. Census Bureau.
All right. So it's their question.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So I guess they must have smoothed the data during those periods or something.
Well, it looks like the scale's different at the bottom, so they just sliced out those years. You see it goes right from 67 to 80.
Oh, you're right, right there. Yeah, it looks like there's years missing in between, what,
Okay.
71, yeah, good
So
observation.
I thought it was you did it, but they handled
Yeah,
it.
no, this was
How about real estate moves? Can you see that in there?
well, I will show you a figure in a minute, I think. I hope I put it in, that shows the growth rate in population in various states over a fairly long period of time. And I think in looking at that, you'll see that there probably is a pretty important real estate role, in terms of people.
It's not true that real estate people move in-state because of real estate.
Well, I think there is. I mean, I think we've seen a lot of that during periods when real estate was moving very rapidly. People turning over houses, sometimes houses that they lived in, sometimes houses that they were just flipping. But yeah, certainly there's. And again, I think it's one of the kind of interesting features about migration is it is very closely tied to housing markets, labor markets, a bunch of other really important markets in our economy. And so I think one of the things that we maybe haven't done or that researchers haven't done enough of in this area is really trying to kind of link all of those, especially theoretically. A lot of the literature in the migration field, and I mean I'm guilty of it here. There isn't much of a model here other than an econometric model, but there probably is a good opportunity for people who are interested in economic theory, microeconomic theory, to really think about modeling all of those things simultaneously. Housing markets, labor markets, the migration process. I think that's a really fruitful area, and it's something that, if anything, we've kind of moved away from professionally. I mean, I don't know. It used to always be people preceded their econometric work with some sort of formal model. That's become more and more rare these days. People kind of jump into the numbers very quickly.
Yes, didn't you teach us that? Not to do that?
Well, I think there's a real important role for modeling, but as I say, that doesn't seem to be the way the profession has moved. I don't know what your perception is, but that's my feeling these days. We get a lot of people coming through on the job market and stuff, and the days when people used to have a really well-defined micro model, and then that led to some kind of econometric specification. Just don't see that much anymore. So, yeah.
I just got inspired by this question that sometimes when we encounter a recession, people might move more frequently, but sometimes not. Is it possible that because people move, they might think there might be better opportunities in the other states because they were measuring state across state migration? So is that possible that in some recessions, those different states they behave differently?
Yeah.
Some might got into recession very severely, but some states are still behaving good because they have different industrial structure in different states. So is there any kind of like measurement about those imbalance development or economic behavior?
Yeah, part of the problem is I don't think we necessarily have very good data, really micro data, that's regularly collected on, and you're the migration person, I think, right? Maybe you know of some data where it really gets at the motivations for moving, more than just this sort of kind of aggregate level stuff. It really requires almost household survey data to sort of ferret out why people have made that decision to move. And I'm sure there is some out there, but I'm not sure we regularly collect that.
Yeah, there are resources for like the push factors for migration, so surveys that ask people why they moved and under what conditions they wanted to move, and then, you know, on the flip side, once they arrive at their place of reception, what factors were kind of pulling them. But we don't have regular data collected, at least at the federal level, on those pull factors themselves. It's really only the people and what motivated them to leave and how they feel once they've arrived. So that kind of
Yeah. And those are, you know, I mean, if you think about your question about movement during recession, you can tell two stories, right? On the one hand, if there's this recession going on, some people are getting laid off, and so it's quite likely some of them are going to move, right? So that would kind of increase migration. At the same time, during a recession, I think people naturally get a little more cautious. So some people who might have moved are now going to kind of cling on to the job that they have because they know it's less certain. And so, again, those are two forces that are working in the opposite way. And you could imagine that in some areas and at some points in time, one of those motives sort of dominates the other. So you could get different directions of migration. So, but I think that's a very, very good point. Let me just go back here for a second. Yeah, the last point I was going to just go back to here, I think it would be kind of interesting to develop a sort of more comprehensive model and econometric strategy that would jointly analyze both these inter and interstate moves. But again, I'm going to end up focusing only on the interstate moves between different states rather than the ones within states. So, it is kind of cool. But my next slide will show you that there's a limit to how far we should go with tricky graphics, right? So it's basically the same kind of graph. And these aren't mine, by the way. I kind of stumbled across these, but I was showing this. I had a grad student who was really enamored with graphics, and I said, graphics are fine, they're really good, but you don't want to get to this stage where you have no clue what it is. Well, you have a little bit of a clue what they're trying to show, but completely unintelligible, you know. Let me kind of bring it back to ground level here a little bit and just show you a little bit in the pattern of some of these migration flows. And I'll pick on Connecticut because that's where I've lived now for quite some time. But during this 2005-2009 period, the average out-migration was, annual average out-migration was 102,000, almost 103,000 people, and the average in-migration was almost 86,000. So clearly we were kind of losing people in this process. The other thing about these moves is that they do involve virtually all other states. In other words, if you go through, the data, you'll see, people are going to every state and coming from every state. But obviously, those numbers are not equal. And in fact, what we find is that the movements are really dominated by kind of a subset of states. In the case of Connecticut, 19 states are among the Connecticut's top 20 destination states and its top 20 origin states. So there's a set of states there that we do a lot of business with, either sending people to or receiving people from. And you can, right now, you can guess what some of them are, right? Yeah.
One would think that all those small states in the Northeast are all really should be analyzed.
Quite a few of them are from the Northeast, right? And in fact, I'll show you in a minute. So as I pointed out here, many of them are neighbors, but not always. So here are I'm not doing all 20 here, just taking the top 10 destination and origin states, and you can see that some of these states appear in both of these lists. So on the left, we've got the leading destinations. New York is a big one. We border on New York. We're tied in with the New York economy. So people who get a job in New York City may move to New York. So there's lots of reasons why you would expect that. The next one's kind of interesting, Florida. And of course, what's going on there?
Retirement.
Well, probably mostly, or a lot of them are retirees, that are moving south. They've had enough of Connecticut winters, and so they want some warmer climes. But then Massachusetts is on the list. Again, sort of one of our neighbors. California is a big recipient of Connecticut residents, but only about half of what are going to those top 3 states, maybe a little less than that. So you can kind of go down the list. You can also maybe see the role of warmer weather in some of this. North Carolina, Georgia, Texas. If you look at the leading origin states, again, New York. Now, it's interesting. We actually get more inflow from New York than we have outflow to New York. Anybody got an idea what might be going on there?
New York's a bigger population.
It is a bigger population, so that's an important factor. But there may be something else too. Yeah.
I would guess people commuting into the city from Connecticut.
Yeah, people who might have started as New York residents, right? But then actually move out to Connecticut. Because remember, these are actual movements of people. They're not just commutes. These are actual relocations. But anybody who might be a New Yorker who decides they're going to live in the Connecticut suburbs and commute, well, they show up in those numbers. Anyway, I just thought I'd show that to you and kind of get some sense that there are a number of states that kind of show up on both sides of the coin. So let's go back to this kind of full sample that we're working with, the 2,652 different flows that we want to try to explain. The recession that began during this period was probably an important factor because it was a particularly strong one. And in fact, let me just show you an interesting little graph that looks at recent recessions. And that what they're showing here is percent of job losses in post-World War II recessions. And the most recent one is this. Okay? So anybody who thinks that the Great Recession shouldn't have been called the Great Recession, this figure kind of makes you think otherwise, that it really was kind of abnormal in terms of both the depth and the length of it too. Notice this blue one here, which one is that? That was back in 48, I guess. That was a sharp recession, immediately after World War II, but we sprang out of it very quickly. Once we kind of jumped out of the war economy and into a more consumer-oriented economy, building lots of new houses and roads and so forth, the economy sprang back pretty quickly. But the most recent recession was pretty deep and pretty long-lasting. And again, this is kind of the national experience. Remember, some states were hit particularly hard, were going to be much worse than this, and other states were influenced much less. So there's a lot of variation in how states responded to the recession. So going back to our full sample again, there's some evidence that the migration response was rather uneven across states. And this little map, I think, kind of shows that. Let me explain a little bit. So here, this is 2005, this is 2010. So this is kind of at the beginning of the period that I'm looking at. This is 1 year after, I guess, the data I have, or that data that I'm using was collected over the 2005 to 2009 period. But you can see, by the way, in the blue is showing the intensity of net in-migration, and the red is showing the intensity of net out-migration. And you can see that there's a fair amount of change in the look of these maps just over that 5-year period. So it appears that the recession certainly had some influence on these patterns of migration, even though it was a relatively short span of time. The changing age profile is also something we probably should be aware of, and therefore, perhaps the age profile even across states. But if you look at this next one, you'll see that, and this was the graph I was referring to a little earlier when somebody brought up the age issue. this is the age sensitivity of migration, and on the vertical axis here, we've got kind of the propensity to migrate, and on the horizontal axis, we've got age, and you can see there's a lot of movement when people are very young. You know, families are more likely to pick up their kids and move to another place before they get into school. Once they kind of get a little bit older, though, that migration rate falls off rather rapidly. And then, of course, right, what's going here? What spikes migration at this age, do you think? College. Everybody going away to college and graduating, all of that good stuff. And then, of course, there's a fairly steady decline. People sort of lock into a lifestyle in a particular area. But then again, in later years, again, it pops up again as people decide that they want a different environment for retirement. Yeah?
In the ACS data, do they phrase the question about migration in such a way that if I'm a college student and I'm a legal dependent of my parents and I move somewhere for 4 years of college but they stay there?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not certain about that. And I don't know, do you know? Have you worked with that closely enough?
Yeah, it's not like I'm moving for college, but that's why I asked about the heads of households, because you can be coded as a dependent. And I mean, it's not in that language, but you are coded as like a family. So a person who's moved, but then if they're, between the ages of 17 and 19, you would be able to see, is that person, a member of a household, or is that person a head of a household? That's kind of how you would get around those temporary movements.
By the way, before I forget, and you're probably aware of this, but there is the other interesting source of migration data is IRS data that's used quite a bit. So you see people tending to use either ACS data or IRS data. Okay, so let's move on here. The fourth point I wanted to make here was that there does appear to be kind of a link between housing prices and migration. And again, this next graph maybe illustrates a little bit of that going on. Here's looking at over time. This was California home prices relative to the U.S. So this is, as a percentage of U.S. home prices. You can see back in 2000 what they were 124% of the sort of U.S. average. But there's been a lot of variation in that over time, and particularly in the, right before the crash of the housing market and this latest recession, California home prices were, there was about a 60% premium over national figures, and I think those figures actually are a bit low, but what you can see is they've kind of overlaid this with the red line, which is the out-migration per 100 immigrants. I'm sorry, I've got those are backwards. The green bars is the net out-migration, the relative home price is the red. But you can see that there seems to be some sort of link there between home prices and this out-migration. Yes.
So you phrased it as high home prices push people out, but I'm wondering whether that can be phrased the other way, which is people move out and then there's...
And home prices fall. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And by the way, I think that was, I think that was not my phrase. I think this was a figure that I pulled from Truly here, and that was their heading for it. And I had the same reaction to it as well, by the way. I wasn't quite sure that was exactly what was going on.
Definitely a correlation.
Yeah, definitely a correlation, right. Okay, so what we're going to show you here are some results for this kind of multivariate model, and again, using this American Community Survey data. And so each of these models is going to include this sort of basic elements of the gravity model, that is the population in each state and the distance between them. And then we're going to hang on there some supplemental variables that are used to capture differences between the origin and the destination. And all of these supplemental variables are expressed in ratio form, and you'll see that in a minute in one of the tables here. But we're going to be looking at some differences in economic conditions, some climatic differences. I also had included included both some health indicators and some measures of access to healthcare. One reason for explicitly doing that in this was when I first gave this paper, it was at a health policy conference, and so I knew that there would be some interest in that particular aspect, and as I may have mentioned, my two areas are really sort of urban and regional and health economics, so it was sort of a natural thing for me to do in terms of combining my interests. So here's the first regression, and you can kind of see the form of this. So we've got the log of population in I and the log of population in J, and you would expect both of those to have a positive effect on migration. In other words, the bigger the mass at the origin and the bigger the mass at the destination, the more people are likely to be drawn from between these 2 points. But you would expect it to be inversely related to distance, and we're seeing that indeed is the case. All of those three kind of prime variables are statistically quite significant. We included the ratio of per capita income. So this is the per capita income in the receiving state relative to the sending state, okay? So it's positive, and again, what that is sort of saying is that people are attracted to higher states with higher per capita income once you control for some of these other factors. And again, just pointing out, all of these are in log form, so these are essentially elasticities, but you have to be a little bit careful because these are elasticities with respect to the ratio, not with respect to just the numerator or just the denominator, but with respect to the ratio. So unemployment rate, sorry, I jumped over one. Gini coefficient is, of course, a measure of inequality. And if people are repelled by inequality, then this should have a negative sign. Or saying it differently, if they're attracted to states with more equal distribution of income, it'll have the sign that we find here. So it appears that people care about not only the kind of median level of income within these places, but also how that income is distributed. All right? Yeah. Yes.
Okay, I just want to know, so Gini coefficient is available for the
States, yes. You can even get Gini coefficients for counties.
Oh, really? Oh, that's very
In fact, I used some of these county Gini coefficients for some stuff that I did on life expectancy, looking at whether or not life expectancy is affected by inequality, the degree of inequality.
And in fact, also I was puzzled, infant mortality rate also is available, but it's,
Oh yeah,
even though
yeah,
there, but
yeah,
is it
yeah.
kind of small in the United States and between the states?
We're higher than too many other countries, unfortunately. But I mean, we do have a, if you look at internationally, we have a relatively low infant mortality rate. But actually, there are a number of other countries that have better infant mortality rates.
Right, but in terms of, is it not as universe as I thought? It kind of will be. I wish I had the raw. I don't know if I have the raw data. We could see the range on it, but there's a fair amount of variability, even when you're looking at it at the state level, even much more so at the county level, of course. There you see some big differences in infant mortality rates across counties. Yes?
And so this is state by state level data?
Yes, yeah.
And it's in numbers? So how many people move?
Right. The number of migrants from state I to state J. We have 52 of these jurisdictions because we're including DC and Puerto Rico. And so there are 51 possible destinations for each state. So if you multiply those two, you have 2,652 observations in the data set.
And did you control for the state size? Because, for example, Texas is so big, like not the population necessarily, but the area.
Well, it is in a sense in that in this basic, whoops, what did I do? I hit something. I wasn't supposed, oh, there we go. Sorry about that. In this basic gravity model, since you're looking at the number of migrants or the log of the number of migrants, the assumption is that will be affected by both the population in the sending state and in the receiving state.
So then, when you're talking about the distance,
Yeah.
you mean distance
Between the states.
or
So,
the middle of the state?
yeah, there's a sort of geographic centroids. You can actually get, geographic coordinates. I got them from a guy in our geography department. So between any pair of states, it's kind of like the average distance from center to center. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect, but it's the best thing we have. You can also get that, by the way, again, for counties. You can get centroid, these centroid, yeah. Yes?
So your interpretation of the Gini coefficient, this. So it seems like if people are moving to better jobs,
Right.
then in places with high Gini coefficient, there might not be that many middle-income jobs, because they might be moving to other places.
Right,
And then
right.
there's only a few of the really high
Right.
income jobs, and that only brings in a few people.
Yeah. Well, but remember, you're controlling for all of these things kind of simultaneously within the multivariate regression model. So the way to interpret this is, okay, suppose we had people moving from one particular state to a couple of other states, and suppose those were identical in all respects, except for the Gini coefficient, right? What this is saying is that on average, people would prefer to go, there would be more migration to the state with the lower Gini coefficient, and the lower Gini coefficient corresponds to more equal income distribution.
We don't seem to have a variable for median income or something. Help with that.
Well, I do have per capita income.
Yeah, but that would include, because when you have high Gini coefficient, you'll still have the high earners.
Oh, you're saying maybe I should use median rather than per capita? Yeah. I could certainly, that might be a good idea. I'm not sure, I guess my expectation is it wouldn't drastically alter things, but that might be interesting to do. See if like this result for the Gini thing is in any way sensitive to how we specify income.
What about even maybe cross, multiple?
Yeah.
Because Gini already
Interact it with, that's another thing you could do, yeah. So some other things, obviously the unemployment, I'm sorry, yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, yeah.
I know, this is
You're in my blind spot here, I'm sorry.
really great. We have 2 interns in the room working on a migration project
Great.
as we speak. So
Yeah.
this question might also be helpful for others who are
Yeah.
in the beginning stages of like lit review, formulating theory, choosing variables.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how it is that you chose these
process.
specific variables? What theory did you use? Theories did you use?
Yeah.
I'm guessing you didn't just like wake
Yeah.
up and think I should probably include the Gini
Yeah,
coefficient.
right.
So where did that come from?
Well,
And-
okay, yeah, so I guess, research is sort of a funny process. I think one of the things I always advise students to do when they're trying to model something is think about how you might react, if you were making this decision, if you were trying to decide whether to migrate or where to migrate to, what kind of factors would be important to you, And obviously some of those might be very particular to the individual, but there probably are going to be a lot of things that a lot of people would think might be important. And I guess that's the way I kind of went about this. Now, the first 3 are really, these are kind of fundamental ingredients of this gravity type model, so those were sort of automatic. I was trying to capture, sort of economic conditions with these 3, the per capita income, Gini coefficient, and unemployment rate. They're all somewhat different types of measures, but they're all obviously tied to the nature of the economy. And we know that one of the reasons people move is for economic purposes, to change jobs and so forth. So you would kind of want, I think, at least some set of variables that try to capture that. I have to admit, I happened to also be interested in the Gini coefficient because I had done this work looking at the effects. I had a model of life expectancy where one of the variables was the Gini coefficient. And you might say, well, why did you, well, but think about it, I mean, if you have conditions of great economic extremes, that's likely to have some impacts, more than just economic impacts, but sort of impacts on people's health and lives and so forth. And sure enough, in the study that I did in that case, it turned out that that higher Gini coefficients, that is more inequality, were associated with lower life expectancy, even after you control for a bunch of other things that influence life expectancy.
I was just gonna ask, did you control for the poverty rate?
Yeah. Or I don't know if I had poverty rate or I know I had per capita income or some measure of kind of the level of income, but I can't remember whether I actually had the poverty rate in there or not. I'd have to go back and look.
What
Yeah.
if you control educational barrier, like you said, people move from
Yeah.
educational pathway, so.
Yeah. Well, and that would be a reasonable thing to include, I think. One of the things that might attract people is moving to an area where there's a high level of educational attainment and there's good educational opportunities, and that's clearly absent right now.
It might have, there might be a multivariate issue with education and like median income.
Yeah.
Or, something like that. So.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of
because they might be correlated each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, guys, he's writing notes, so it means that we are giving
Well,
contribution.
yeah, no, please. That's why we give papers, right? To get good ideas. So the next one is also sort of an economic variable. The median gross rent is really kind of a fundamental cost of living thing. It turns out, people spend a big chunk of their income on rents, and in fact, it's one of the variables one of the economic variables that varies quite a lot. So in a lot of these things, you kind of want to control for not just income, but also, in some sense, cost of living, and I'm doing that here with this median gross rent variable. The next two, mean temperature and precipitation, were again meant to be kind of environmental variables. And then the last three, I had, these are sort of measures of, I guess, health status, if you like, infant mortality rate, life expectancy. This isn't exactly health status, it's the percent insured, so it's kind of the level of coverage that people have on average in terms of healthcare expenses. And you can see that what the green shaded ones are the ones that are significant. The ones in yellow are not. And so it appears in this particular case that the economic factors were kind of dominating this, perhaps with the exception of temperature, which again is not a complete surprise. People do tend to like warmer climates, and that's kind of reflected in the result as well. Yeah?
Yeah, so your data is from 2005 to 2009. So
Yeah.
what about if you include time candy variables or time trend?
Well, remember now, I don't have data for each of those 5 years. It's a 5-year window over which the data are collected. And so the way you have to kind of interpret these data points is it's kind of an average that's derived from data within that period. And hopefully it's a little more precise because it's over a kind of a larger window and we have more information to go with. But I don't know. Do you wrestle with the ACS and how to interpret this? I mean, maybe I'm the only one who has problems with it. But.
No, it's hard to explain, but yeah, you don't think about it like he's looking at the change between 2005 to 2009. It's just pretend 2005 to 2009 is like 1 year,
right.
and it's like the average of all those 5 years.
Yeah.
And this is that one, so it's one point in time. It's just a different kind of way to think about
The data has been collected from.
Yeah, 1 point is no longer a year, 1 point is 5 years.
Yes, sorry.
As long as we're brainstorming here.
Yeah, good. Good. That's great.
How about like the age, like Rustin mentioned before, like the average age in a state? Because that might take
Oh, yeah.
the mean temperature thing.
Yeah, you're
It
right.
might just be people moving to Florida and Arizona.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But that might, if you include education, those might have multiple linearity problems.
Yeah, you got that with all, all this cross-sectional stuff. I mean, multiclinear is just a given. You know you're going to have a lot, and you try to, minimize it a bit, but it is a problem.
So in that age also, I think it kind of then supports that hypothesis. Remember when we looked at the graph?
Yeah, right.
You said maybe age would be influenced.
Yes, right. And I don't know why I don't. Yeah, that's interesting.
Especially in the in the close recent
Yeah.
recessions.
I don't recall having. I don't know, because I did talk about age there. So I wonder if I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of good.
But that's a very good point. So I got age, educational attainment. Any other ones you want to throw in here? Yeah.
Actually, I have a question. So I understand that it's a 5-year period.
Okay.
But still, I feel like for a person, people are not perfectly mobile because they have a job,
Right.
a contract,
Right.
or a house. So it takes time for them to move. So could it be that, we have...
You should lag the data or something?
No.
Yeah.
Could it be that income and rent from previous
Right.
periods
Right.
could affect this because it's kind of lagged?
Yeah.
Maybe, so
Yeah.
before that.
And we could do that by lagging some of these variables. So the hypothesis would be that the behavior we're observing during this 5-year period is affected not just by the contemporary data, but by the preceding data as well. And that would be easy enough to do. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there's some effort in gathering data, but conceptually that would be pretty easy to do. Yeah, I think that.
Because people kind of they don't.
That's right. It's not. It can be an instantaneous decision, but it's not always. Especially probably the more deliberative kinds of choices. People probably just don't wake up one morning and say, well, "I'm going to move because I'm worried about my job or something." So yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
One
Yeah.
thing, I'm not really quite sure. So when you're saying rent or
Right.
temperature, J over I, so it means that temperature in the state that you're moving divided over temperature where you're moving from.
Yes, exactly. Right. So, for example, the higher that ratio is, it means the more expensive that destination state is relative to the state I'm in, the less likely I am to move, right? All else the same. I mean, I prefer to move to a state that's more affordable, right? Once we control for everything else. So yeah, the ratio, obviously if you flip the ratio and you had I over J, all these expected signs would reverse, right? Yeah.
I would propose to use the level of the unemployment rate instead of the log, and maybe you can say why I'm wrong. Because if you have two states, one has 1% unemployment, one has 2% unemployment.
Right.
It looks like the ratio is 2 to 1, but really one state could have 99% employment, and the other has 98%. It's
Yeah.
really not.
Yeah. Well, I kind of log everything because, for one thing, it makes these coefficients a little more interpretable because, again, there are elasticities. When you do a log-log model, right? Log on the left, logs on the right. The coefficients have the interpretation of being elasticities of the left-hand side variable with respect to each of these variables on the right-hand side. But in this particular case, it's not to the it's an elasticity with respect to the ratio of those two figures. So you have to be a little bit, cautious in the way you interpret these. It's a little bit different than the way we sometimes, see elasticities presented. Yeah.
Could you use some measure of entrepreneurial activity or jobs created?
Well, what you might use, it is interesting. They have, there is data, for example, on patents by state, number of patents, things like that. That might be a proxy for, inventiveness or entrepreneurial activity.
Or a number of businesses created.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about it, the possible range of data is almost limitless because there's a lot of stuff at the state level that you can make use of. But I want to make sure. How are we for time? I don't
Well,
want.
we kind of over, but I'm thinking if we can finish it by noon.
I think I only have another slide or
Okay,
two,
which
so I
is-
think I'm almost done.
Because we're good in terms of
Okay.
discussing, I think.
Well, I'll tell you what, let me finish, I think I've only got one or two more slides, and then maybe we can, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we don't
yeah.
want
To know if you could possibly include some sort of tax rate.
Very good, and I want to make a comment about that. There's, I think one of the papers that I'll list here in a moment actually looks at some of these fiscal variables. And those of you that are familiar with the public finance literature, there's this famous paper by Thibault that was written back in the 50s. Probably, by the way, the most cited paper in all of economics. I mean, you just do not see a paper in, public finance or urban economics that doesn't somehow, cite this Thibault paper. It's a very, very simple idea. There was a lot of concern about the efficiency of providing public goods. If you have to provide a common amount of a public good and everybody consumes that, right? That's kind of the definition of a public good. They consume it in its full amount. Well, not everybody's preferences are going to be satisfied. Some people are going to want less, some people are going to want more. And in fact, in general, most people are going to want a different amount than is being provided. And Thibault came along and said, look, this is interesting and it is kind of a problem with certain kinds of public goods, but a lot of the goods we provide through the public sector, there's a mechanism to deal with that. And particularly state and local public goods, these localities, these states offer a bundle of local goods, local public goods, and they offer certain taxes to raise revenues to pay for that. Well, one of the ways people match their preferences to these alternatives is by moving. They literally, as he described it, they vote with their feet. They get up and they move to a jurisdiction that is more compatible with their own tastes about public goods. And there actually is some stuff in the migration literature where they've included taxes and measures of public goods. In fact, I think, as I say, I think one of the papers I'm going to show you or refer to might be a good place to go to look at that. So, yes?
I'm also wondering if there could be a correlation between person insured and unemployment rate and income per capita.
Yeah. Well, there certainly could be, and again, I don't think I have a slide of the correlation matrix, but I'm sure that a number of these variables are.
Doing the healthcare analysis project now, I also wonder if you should account for the difference between what kind of insurance you get, because there's a huge difference for coverage between Medicare, Medicaid, and
other kinds of insurance. Yeah, right. And again, you can get a lot of that detail, especially at the state level. If you dig in there, there's a lot of potential to sort of parse that out into more information. And of course, the nice thing is you've got a lot of observations here, so you can have a much larger number of variables without worrying about degrees of freedom too much. So.
One question for.
Yes. Sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. This reminded me of your question about like different people have different preferences for public goods.
Right.
Has there been any kind of pushback on including the Gini coefficient because some people prefer income inequality?
I haven't had much pushback on that. I mean, I think that's conceivable, that there might well be people, I would think more at the upper end of the income spectrum, who might prefer a high degree of inequality. And in fact, it would be interesting, kind of along your lines, of interacting the Gini coefficient with level of income to see whether or not, that is true. That's a really good idea. Yeah.
And then it's also the other thing, we were struggling with measuring diversity.
Yeah.
So maybe.
But it seems like the Gini coefficient is kind of a proxy for racial diversity as well. Is that right?
It could be, yeah. I didn't necessarily intend it as such, but yeah, it certainly could be. Yeah.
But that's what we were wondering. Is there going to be pushback on people who do not prefer racial and ethnic diversity?
Sure. Yeah.
And how to get around that?
Yeah.
So if you do interact, then maybe Gini with race.
Yeah.
Well, they might mean the same thing.
You guys are building me a very big model. Okay.
So,
Just because we are really working on some projects.
well, that's good.
Because we're struggling to
Yeah.
connect those variables.
And as I say, I think this is a really kind of fruitful area. I mean, there's a lot out there that's been done over the years, but as I say, interestingly, a big portion of that literature was kind of in the, couple decades old. I mean, I think there's probably a little less going on now than there was at one time. So what I did here, notice this is essentially the same model, except I appended a couple of other health-related variables here. So these are kind of healthcare resource variables, hospital beds per 1,000, physicians per 1,000. They both seem to have positive effects, but again, they weren't significant, okay? So now, I'll just point out, I mean, this is, I guess, kind of what I expected to find during this period, this recessionary period, was that the economic factors would sort of dominate. I think a really interesting thing to do would be to replicate this during a period where the economy is really robust to see whether or not these kind of things start to, play more of a role. Sort of quality of life things that might. I don't think I have a feeling I didn't put in this one slide I was going to show you, but anyway. Let's see. So, quickly, conclusions. This gravity type model seems to do a pretty good job of explaining a fair amount of this variation in these flows. Each state's population size seems to be important, and the flow is negatively related to distance, so it kind of upholds this premise of the gravity type model. And by the way, the gravity model is one that's been used a lot in migration studies, so it's nothing, I can't claim any uniqueness on that front. It's a pretty well-received framework for doing that. Economic differences seem to matter. They seem to be drawn to higher income, but also more income equality seems to have a positive effect. Lower housing costs and higher temperatures seem to attract migrants. Health indicators and access to care appear to matter a lot less, at least during these periods of recession. And again, the final point here that I made just a moment ago is I think it would be good to sort of replicate this, or even broaden the time frame so that you have periods of both recession and economic expansion, and see if you can't capture this shift in emphasis during those different periods by the way you specify that model. So these were, again, I just threw up a few of these earlier studies some of you might be interested in, especially if you're doing work on this. This Richard Sebula has done a lot of work over the years, and this was a reasonably recent thing from 2006, where they were looking at net interstate migration. This piece by, oops, sorry, I keep doing this. How do I go back here? Can I go back this way? No. Hang on. What happened?
I'll go to the last slide, right?
Yeah,
Okay, and now I close.
there we are. I'm sorry. I'll put this clicker down and then I won't mess it up. The piece by Newbold, whoops. It'll come back. Just leave it. Yeah, there. Okay. Determinants of elderly interstate migration. I said a lot of this literature kind of focused on specific groups. Mine was kind of all migrants, but some people have focused on the elderly, some people on the young. So there's a lot of variation there. Isserman's another kind of big name in this area. Done a lot of stuff on migration. Isserman and Plain. Forecasting interstate migration with limited data. This was in JASA, the Journal of the American Statistical Association. But this goes all the way back to 85. I've kind of tried to include some things from various time periods here. And you can see Sebula's earlier work. This was back in the 70s that he was doing some stuff. And this is the one I was referring to about the kind of invoking this Thibault hypothesis. In other words, does it appear that people are taking into account these fiscal factors in making their movements between states? We tend to think the Thibault hypothesis more at kind of a local level, people choosing a community. But
To some extent, I think it operates at a state level as well. People complain about certain states being high tax states and other praise other states as being low tax states or having particularly good public services. So there is some of that goes on, and you even see a certain amount of that at the international level, right? People, migrate to tax havens. So it's a fairly general kind of idea that somehow the profile of the public sector in the economy has some impact on those decisions that people make. So
Terence, we will have that PowerPoint slide.
yes, absolutely, yeah. In fact, I think it may already be.
Yeah, it's on.
Michelle already got a copy of it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Yeah, and if any of you have any further ideas, suggestions, please feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to have them. So.
Any questions, comments so far? No questions?
Yes.
I just had another. What about do you know if there's data available on worker productivity on a state level?
I think. Well, yeah, you can construct it. You could just use GDP per worker, I suppose. It's kind of that's a pretty broad measure of productivity, but we have state level GDP by year, and we certainly have, labor force or number employed. You might want GDP per employed individual or something like that.
I guess that'd be the same as per capita income.
Well, except, I mean, it is going to be pretty much the same. It's going to be very highly correlated, but it would be more I guess, at least in principle, more a measure of productivity because we kind of think of GDP as a measure of output or the value of output. But
your GDP would include things like, natural resources and things like that. So if you can get TFP.
Well, it includes all sorts of stuff. It includes, obviously both goods and services. And what you might want is real GDP per worker, because then you've kind of taken the price out of it. You've gotten a little bit closer to a quantity measure, or output per worker, right? But I don't know if any of you have used GDP data, but the Bureau of Economic Analysis has a pretty nice website where you can get all this state level, both national and state level data, and it's nice because it's really easy to download. Some of these sites, they make it so difficult to download their data. Other ones are really good about it, So I don't know who was next, but let me let you, because I don't think you asked a question yet.
Okay. Building on the diversity topic, I was wondering if it applies to your research at all. If you look into a foreign-born individuals or individual with some certain heritage, like some cultural background,
yeah,
in relation to the state that the person moved to and the dominating, maybe foreign community.
Right.
I think that might be something we can look into. And also, I was just thinking in terms of actual person migrating. I was wondering how much the Gini coefficient would come into play because. If a person's gonna migrate, I was wondering, as a person,
do they care about it?
Yeah, do they look into it? They're what's the inequality in what is Gini coefficient in that state? Yeah. And
I think what it may be reflecting more. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's too blanket a statement. I guess I tend to think of places that have a very high degree of income inequality is more likely to, for example, you may have extremes of wealth, but you may also have pockets of extreme poverty and all of the sort of social problems that might go with that, right? High crime rates and so forth. So in that sense, it might be kind of a proxy for, it might be an indicator not so much of, or people might be saying, that what they really care about is the sort of condition of the community that they're moving to, and that they think that might be in better condition if, in fact, there's a little more income equality than if you have these kind of extremes. I don't know. I think there are different ways you can interpret that, but as I say, it did seem to be significant, and I say one of the ones I found interesting was this impact on life expectancy, because, and I've had some people question that, you know, is that really happening? Well, I don't know. I think maybe it is. You know, I think high degrees of inequality are inherently kind of unhealthy for society. But that's I'm reflecting a little bit of my personal philosophy there, I guess. But anyway, yes.
Have you looked at or thought about state debt as one of the factors? So
About what?
state debt.
Oh, state debt. Oh, that's interesting. No, I haven't. I haven't.
With all of your health variables, have you tried
Yeah.
running with just like one in the regression?
Yeah, yeah, that would be interesting. And again, it kind of goes along with this Chibo stuff, right? You know, that might be another sort of fiscal variable that people would be concerned about. Do I want to move to a state that has this very high debt load? That means I'm probably going to be paying a lot of taxes down the road as, you know, we try to bail ourselves out of this situation.
Might be able to help separate the physical from
Yeah.
the public.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. So, yes.
I'm just thinking about in addition to the income per capita level of the states, is it more like more? Is it better to like include another variable with the change of income per capita?
Kind of the trajectory.
Yeah, because like immigration is like changing.
Yeah.
So maybe people for a state that way is like higher growth rate in the income per capita.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
You know, if you had two states and one where they both had the same level of per capita income, but in one it's been growing at 5% a year and the other one's been growing at 1% a year, well, that might make a difference, right? Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So.
Any other questions, comments? Well, okay, Dr. Heffley, it was very informative to us.
Well, you guys have been a great group, by the way. You know, sometimes it's really hard to get people to sort of participate. You've been very good, so
Great participants, I think.
appreciate that.
Right? Doing great. It was a great discussion.
Good. Good. I'm glad you.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for.
Thank you.